Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Who the hell are all you people? Is the food that bad in the cafeteria, sir? It's great to see so many folks out. I feel like I'm not spending enough time in Edmonton. I was out at St. Albert last night for an event there and had a great crowd, and they spontaneously sang me happy birthday. So I'm going to have to come back more often, clearly. Thank you to Marie and to the CLC for the invitation to be here. And thanks to all of you for spending your lunch with me. I'm going to do a couple of different things. I'm going to read a couple of short sections from the latest book, Sweetland. Marie has asked me to read something from Galore, so I'll do a little bit from the novel before this one. And then if there's time at the end, I'd like to read a couple of poems as well from the most recent collection, Under the Keel. And that should get us to about 4 o'clock. And then if there's time after that, I'd be happy to answer questions if anybody had any. So, does that sound like an all right plan? Okay. Except for the 4 o'clock thing. Okay. I'll try to get you out of here by 3:30. Just to give you a little bit of background for the novel Sweetland, which came out this August. Sweetland is set on a tiny island off the south coast of Newfoundland. And the island is called Sweetland. And the main character of the book is also named Sweetland, Moses Sweetland. And the setup for the novel has to do with something called resettlement, which is something that's been a big issue in Newfoundland for much of the last 40 or 50 years. When Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, or as I like to say, when Canada joined Newfoundland in 1949, the Smallwood government was tasked with providing services to Newfoundlanders on the same level that Canadians in the rest of the country had come to expect in terms of education, medical care, roads, the works. And that was almost an impossible task because much of Newfoundland's population was scattered around, I think it's about 18,000 miles of coastline, in thousands of often tiny communities in very remote locations. So the task of trying to provide services to that scattered population was something that they knew was not doable. And one of the solutions they came up with was something that was known as the resettlement program, which was a huge social engineering project. And what they did was they went to hundreds and hundreds of these tiny communities and offered them money to pull up stakes and move to larger communities. Technically, it was a voluntary program, but it was not so much. And a lot of people left those communities under duress. And a lot of people, I think, ended up living the rest of their lives in a kind of internal exile in Newfoundland. And thousands of people were scarred. I think they moved close to 15,000 people out of hundreds of communities. And that program officially ended in the early 70s. And it was a stain among the many stains on the Smallwood government. This was one of the big ones. What has been happening recently in Newfoundland is we've seen a revival of the whole issue of resettlement. But it's very different this time around. In 1992, the Canadian government imposed a moratorium on cod fishing in Newfoundland. It was meant to be a short-term moratorium. They were talking 2 to 3 years. It's now in its 22nd year. And in most of these small communities in Newfoundland, their only reason for being where they are is because they were close to the cod. And if you look at where these places are located, there is nothing else to recommend human habitation in most of these places without the cod. And what's happened over the last 20 years is that most of the young people have left these communities to look for work elsewhere, up in Fort Mac or on the oil rigs or in Ontario. So over time, these small communities have become much smaller. They've become much older. In a lot of these communities, most of the people still living there are seniors. I visited I do this circumnavigation of Newfoundland with an outfit called Adventure Canada. And we visited this summer a place called Little Bay Islands, which was once like a hub of the cod fishery on the shore. And in Little Bay Islands this year, there was one kid in school. And most of the rest of the people living there were seniors. It's a 3 to 4 hour ferry ride to see a doctor or to pick up groceries. So what's happening in some of these communities now is that people are going to the government instead of the other way around. And they're saying, give us a package. Buy us out of our homes. And we'll move somewhere more central. You won't have to run ferries out here. You won't have to provide medical care or education. So it's a long-term economic win for the government. So they're interested. They're so interested, in fact, that in a recent budget, they almost tripled the amount of money that they're offering to people, from $100,000 a household to $270,000 a household. And $270,000 buys a lot of house in Newfoundland. So more and more communities are looking at this seriously now. The catch, up until very recently, the catch was everybody had to sign on. Absolutely everybody in a community had to agree to the move before the government would agree to it. And as many as 5 or 6 years ago, I started hearing what I'm sure were apocryphal stories about communities where everybody was ready to move except for one person who was holding out. And I started thinking back then that a book about the one person who was holding out in that situation might be an interesting book. And so the story of this, of Sweetland, is the story of that one holdout, a man named Moses Sweetland. And I thought I would start just by reading a couple of books. I know there's at least one person here from the reading last night, and I promised all new readings. This one is the same one, but after this, it's all new. Just to give you some setup for the book, this is from the very beginning of the novel. And I think that's all you need to know for this. He saw the government man walking up from the water. The tan pants, the tweed jacket and tie. The same fellow who came out for the last town meeting, or one exactly like him. There seemed to be an endless supply on hand at the Confederation building in St. John's. The briefcase looking for all the world like something that was in his hand when he left his mother's womb. Sweetland turned away from the window as if he could hide from the man by not looking his way. Glimpsed a flash of him as he went to the front door of the house, heard the knock. No one in the cove ever knocked at a door. He thought to ignore it, but the knock came a second, and then a third time, and he pushed away from the table, went out through the hallway. No one in the cove used their front doors either. Sweetland's hadn't been open in years, and he had to jimmy it loose of the frame. The man standing there lost in the sun's glare, a voice from the nothing where his mouth should be. Mr. Sweetland? He waited until the figure resolved out of the light, until he could see the eyes. Just come off the ferry, did you? Just this second, yes. Sweetland nodded. I must be some fucking important, he said. The government man smiled up at him. You're at the top of my list, he said. Sweetland stood to one side to let the man by. Cup of tea? You don't have coffee by any chance? I got instant. Tea is fine, the government man said. Sweetland moved the kettle onto the stove while the young one took a seat at the table. He tried to think of when a stranger sat there last, seeing the kitchen for the first time. Low ceilings, the beams an inch or two clear of Sweetland's crown. Painted wood floor, a daybed under one window, a formica table with chrome legs pushed up to the other. His mother's china teacups on hooks below the cupboards. All so familiar to him, he hadn't noticed it in years. The man's briefcase was lying on the table in front of him like a placemat, and Sweetland set a spoon and the sugar bowl on the flat surface of it. No sugar for me, the youngster said, setting the bowl to one side. A drop of milk if you have some. No fresh, Sweetland said, just tin. Tea is fine, the government man said. Tin is fine, the government man said. He took a blackberry from his coat pocket and held it to the window a moment. You're not the fellow who was out last time around. No, I just took over the file. You won't get a cell phone signal out here, Sweetland told him. The government man shrugged. The edge of the civilized world, he said. They was talking about putting up a tower years back. Never got around to it. The government man gestured past him to the counter. "You have a laptop there." Sweetland glanced over his shoulder to confirm the fact. "We got the internet for long ago. Does my banking on that," he said. "Bit of online poker. Passes the time." Sweetland poured the tea and took a seat directly across the table. "You're not on Facebook, are you?" "Look at this face," Sweetland said. And the government man glanced down at the table. "Now Arsebook," he said. "That's something I'd sign up for." "I'm sure it's coming," the government man said. "I wouldn't doubt it, given the state of things." It was an easy road into the subject at hand, and he was surprised the government man didn't take it, smiling out the window instead. Perfect teeth. They all had perfect teeth these days. Careful haircuts, accents Sweetland couldn't place. This one might be from the mainland somewhere, for all he could tell. "So," the younger man said abruptly, "are you coming to the meeting this afternoon?" Sweetland almost laughed. "Not planning on it, no." "I couldn't talk you into it?" "Listen," Sweetland said, "I'm not the only one who voted against this thing." "That's true. 45 in favor, 3 against by the most recent ballot. But as of yesterday, yours is one of only 2 households who have not agreed to take the package we're offering." "2, Sweetland said. The government man paused there to let the information sink in. He stirred his tea slowly, the clink of the spoon like a broken lever inside a mechanical doll. "It's just me and Loveless. That's where things stand," he said. Sweetland rubbed absently at the tabletop a moment and then excused himself. He went out through the hall and up the narrow stairs to the bathroom. He put the toilet seat down and sat there a few minutes, leaning an elbow on the windowsill. He could see the back of Loveless's property from there, the ancient barn, the single gaunt cow with its head to the grass. Loveless famously drank a pint of kerosene when he was a toddler, which to Sweetland's mind told you everything you needed to know about the man. He had suffered a 24-hour attack of hiccups while he passed the fuel, his diapers reeking of oil and shit. No one was allowed to light a match near the youngster for a week. And it was all down now to him and to fucking Loveless. Thanks. Thank you. So that's the start of the novel. And in the first half of the book, Sweetland spends most of his time trying to forestall what is largely inevitable. And in the second half of the novel, Sweetland spends the entire second half of the novel alone on the island. And nobody knows he's out there. In between, we get to learn a little bit about the background, Sweetland's background, and the history of the place as well. And the novel really is about belonging and about how we are or aren't made for the place where we live. I don't know how many of you are familiar with our moose problem in Newfoundland. People are constantly being killed or maimed on the highways because we're hitting moose on the highways. On the northern peninsula, there are actually more moose than people. I was shocked to discover when I was in my 20s that moose are not native to Newfoundland. Moose were introduced in the early years of the 20th century. I think it was 6 pairs of moose were released in Newfoundland, and now there are, I think, about 180,000 moose there. In the 1960s, the wildlife department of the provincial government thought, since moose had done so well, they might take a shot at bringing another large game animal to Newfoundland, and they imported a crowd of buffalo to Newfoundland and set them loose on a small island off the south coast of Newfoundland. And that became an episode in the novel. So I'm going to read a little bit about that. And Sweetland in the novel is one of the people who was involved in setting the buffalo on the island. Sweetland was just home from his first stint in Toronto and was working as a deckhand on a schooner shipping dry goods and saltfish along the Salt Coast, the Sicilian Marie. They had sailed across the strait to Cape Breton to pick up the bison. The animals harried into individual containers, and a crane lifting them off the dock, setting them into an improvised pen in the hold. 24 altogether, most of them yearling females, 2 bulls. Unlikely looking things, 1,000 pounds each, and most of the weight in the massive head and shoulders, top heavy on those stick legs. The opposite of icebergs, Sweetland thought, 9/10 above the water. The animals were wall-eyed, drugged up, and stinking of shit and fear. 5 had died in the rail car on the trip from Manitoba, and Sweetland thought it would be a miracle if any survived the ocean crossing. It was the Wildlife Department wanting to add another large game animal to the few in the province that landed them there. They planned to set the bison out on Little Sweetland to determine there was no disease risk to local animals, after which the herd was meant to be introduced to the larger island of Newfoundland, though that step was never taken. The Cecilian Marie sailed past Sweetland to overnight in Miquelon. They got drunk there, the wildlife officers and Sweetland, anchored off the last crumb of New France that was still a French territory. It was the only time he'd ever visited the place. The wildlife officers were all Newfoundlanders but for the fellow in charge, an American from Nevada, who requested to stop in Miquelon. He took every chance he could get, he said, to spend a night in France. Wet and mozzy when they arrived at Tilt Cove the following morning. Dozens of people had sailed out from Fortune Bay and the Burin to watch the event, the harbor packed with boats and spectators on the roofs of the houses still standing in the cove. There was nowhere for the freighter to dock, and they anchored off in deeper water, the buffalo loaded into their individual crates to be ferried ashore on a raft built by the wildlife officers. They had hired Duke Fuhr to tow the raft back and forth with his longliner. Sweetland was on the crane for the first dozen transfers, lowering the boxes onto the flat beside the schooner. The bison sedated and more or less quiet as they were hauled onto dry land, staggering into the open with a stunned air about them, shaking those big rigged shoulders and prancing drunkenly up away from the water. The people on the roofs hooting and shouting in disbelief as the mythological creatures wandered about in a forlorn herd, traveling and turning in a huddle, pawing at the sedge moss, sniffing the salt air. Sweetland took a turn on the raft after lunch, and he stood with the wildlife officer as each crate was floated in, holding the top of the box to keep his place on the narrow flat. Ashore, he stood at the rear as the officer opened the door. If it needed encouragement to step into the open, Sweetland prodded the animal's backside with a stick through a custom-made hole. "They'll come right through the wall if they minds to kick," the officer warned him. "So watch yourself." The animals had all been sedated in the morning, but they seemed to be crawling out of that fog as the afternoon wore on. The next to last cow was bawling before she was lifted off the schooner, rocking the crate in the air. They cinched the container to the flat, the buffalo's hooves making the walls shake as they spidered around the outside. The smell and motion of the water seemed to unhinge her altogether, and she slammed against the box as they started toward the landing site. All the wooden joints coming loose as the animal panicked inside, the container coming apart before they traveled 30 yards towards shore. The wildlife officer pitched into the water as the buffalo pushed for the clear, and he grabbed a corner of the raft to hold himself afloat. Sweetland made a wild, stupid lunge for the animal's tail, as if he could have picked her up like a rat. There wasn't room enough on the raft for the creature to turn around. She tried to catch herself at the edge, but bowled over, top-heavy as she was. A splintered wall of the crate was floating beside the raft, and the buffalo fell onto it, the wooden sheet tipping beneath her weight. Sweetland standing over her as she thrashed, trying to right herself. She went down slowly at first, submerging like a boat taking on water. But once she was under, she sank like a stone, as though she was on a line and being dragged down from below. That dark face staring up at Sweetland on the surface, eyes wide, bubbles streaming from the massive nostrils. He could see her descending through the clear water for a long, long time. And I'll just do one more very brief bit, if I can find it. As I mentioned, almost all of the book takes place on this tiny island of Sweetland. But there are a couple of very brief interludes in which Sweetland goes to what's referred to in the book as fucking old Toronto to look for work in the 60s. So I'll just finish with this book with a really brief account of one of their trips to Toronto. This is him and his friend Duke Fuhrer. They found work building split-level bungalows among crews of Italians and Hungarians and Caribbeans. They were so far outside the city that it was only Saturday evenings they could make the trek into Toronto. They drank at the Caribou Club, a new bar catering to the expats who'd left Newfoundland to work in Ontario's packing plants and factories, in the auto sector, on road gangs. Economic refugees mourning the anachronistic little world they'd abandoned, the squat salt boxes that housed 3 generations, the brawling weather, the root cellars and fish flakes and outhouses, the rabbit warren of bloodlines knitting the tiny outports into impossible tangles. Old Sam and Dominion Ale and cod liver oil, Tibbs Eve and Candlemas Day and Sheila's Brush and Radway's Ready Relief, Jackie Tars and Culcannon and breakfast fish. A weakness for superstition and singing and tribal politics. An antediluvian vocabulary spoken in accents so inbred and misshapen they felt like foreigners everywhere else in the city. The club was on College Street in the heart of Little Italy. A yearly membership fee of $2.50. They drank with familiar strangers from Conception Bay and the Codroy Valley in Placentia, from the French shore, the Bay of Islands, the Burin, men who made twice their wages packing meat or watching bottles trundle along conveyor belts or marking time on assembly lines of one description or other. The crowd drunken and good-naturedly nostalgic, arguing the merits of punts and skiffs and dories, talking Joey Smallwood or the Newfie Bullet or Churchill Falls, or whether beer mixed with ginger ale was a fit drink for a lady. The Caribou Show Band packing the dance floor dressed in their red polyester sport jackets. They stayed until the club closed its doors and then moved on to house parties, sometimes winding up in a city park or a cemetery where they slept under trees or between the graves. Woke on damp grass in the open air, their clothes and hair wet with dew. They took their all-day hangovers to a restaurant on College with a bottomless cup of coffee, then to movies at the Odeon or to wrestling shows at Maple Leaf Gardens, before hitching a ride back out to the work site in the evening, talking all the time about when they might be able to jack up and move home. I flew in yesterday. I told this story yesterday too, but I left Newfoundland very early yesterday morning, and my flight was at 7, so I was at the airport by 5:45, and I was sitting in the departures lounge, and down at gate 1, somebody at 6 o'clock in the morning hauled out an accordion and started playing Gray Foggy Day. And not only did he not get lynched, but the people around him started singing along. And when he finished, everybody in departures applauded. And I thought, where is this place? I'm going to read a short section from Galore, which is the novel that came out in 2009. And Galore is kind of, in a way, it's a novel about that guy playing the accordion in departures at 6 o'clock in the morning. Before I wrote Galore, I'd written a couple of novels that were about particular historical events. And I really did not want to do that again. And this book, instead, was more, I was interested in the folklore of Newfoundland, in that incredible well of stories and superstitions and songs that Newfoundlanders have produced, the oral culture has produced over the last 300 to 350 years. And it's an incredibly rich tradition. And in some ways, I feel like the folklore of Newfoundland it's kind of like the cultural DNA of Newfoundland. It's what makes Newfoundland different from anywhere else in the world. It's what makes that place and those people unique in the world. And I wanted to write a novel that was kind of a celebration of that. So my idea, when I started doing the work on the book, was I was going to go to the archives and read community histories and talk to as many people as I could, and I was going to collect the most outrageous, most outlandish stories I could find in the tradition and stuff them all into one book. And that's more or less what I did. And the book's called Galore, and I'll just read a few pages from the opening of the book, which is sort of shows the arrival of one of the main characters of the novel, one of the few characters who carries through the entire book. It's a multi-generational story set in a fictional outport. It basically follows, just to give you a sense of the setup, it basically follows two families through 6 or 7 generations. One is an Irish Catholic family, the Devines, and the matriarch of that family is a woman who's known only as Devine's widow. She's so old when the book opens that no one can remember her Christian name. The other family is a Protestant English family, the Sellers family. And the patriarch of that family is a guy who's known as Crummey Sellers. He's called Crummey because he has a penchant for cheating at checkers. And Crummey and Devine's widow absolutely despise one another. And their relationship ends up coloring all of the relations between those families down through the next 6 or 7 generations. Although by the end of the book, there's been so much clandestine back and forth between the two families. It's basically the same family. Anyway, this is the opening of the novel, and it's the arrival of Judah in Paradise Deep. He ended his time on the shore in a makeshift asylum cell, shut away with the profligate stink of fish that clung to him all his days. The great white, St. Jude of the lost cause, sea orphan. He seemed more or less content there, gnawing at the walls with a nail. Mary Tryphena Devine brought him bread and dried capelin that he left to gather blue bottles and mold on the floor. If you aren't going to eat, she said, at least have the decency to die. Mary Tryphena was a child when she first laid eyes on the man, a lifetime pass. End of April and the ice just gone from the bay. Most of the shore's meager population, the Irish and West Country English and the bushborns of uncertain provenance, were camped on the grey sand waiting to butcher a whale that had beached itself in the shallows on the feast day of St. Mark. This was during a time of scarcity when the ocean was barren and gardens went to rot in the relentless rain, and each winter threatened to bury them all. They weren't whalers, and no one knew how to go about killing the Leviathan, but there was something in the humpback's unexpected offering that prevented the starving men from hacking away while the fish still breathed, as if that would be a desecration of the gift. They had scaled the whale's back to drive a stake with a maul, hoping to strike some vital organ, and managed to set it bleeding steadily. They saw nothing for it then but to wait for God to do his work, and they sat with their splitting knives and fish prongs, with their dip nets and axes and saws and barrels. The wind was razor sharp, and Mary Tryphena lost all feeling in her hands and feet, and her little arse went dunch on the sand while the whale expired in imperceptible increments. Jabez Trim waited out at intervals to prod at the fat saucer of an eye and report back on God's progress. Mary Tryphena was asleep when the men finally rushed the shallows, her father shouting for her to fetch Devine's widow. She left the beach as she was told, walking the waterside pathway through Paradise Deep. She crossed the headland that rose between the two coves and carried on into the gut where her grandmother had delivered Mary Tryphena's brother that morning. The landwash was red with blood by the time she and the old woman made their way back, a scum of grease on the harbor's surface. Women and children floated barrels in the shallows to catch the ragged squares of blubber thrown down to them. Mary Tryphena's grandmother knotted her skirts above the knee before wading grimly into the water. The ugly work went on through the day. Black fires were burning on the beach to render the blubber to oil, and the stench stoppered the harbor as if they were laboring in a low-ceiling warehouse. The white underbelly was exposed where the carcass keeled to one side, the stomach's membrane floating free in the shallows. The toucher triplets were poking idly at the massive gut with splitting knives and prongs. Dirty seawater pouring from the gash they opened, a crest of blood, a school of undigested capelin and herring, and then the head appeared, the boys screaming and falling away at the sight. It was a human head, the hair bleached white. One pale arm flopped through the ragged incision and dangled into the water. For a time, no one moved or spoke, watching as if they expected the man to stand and walk ashore of his own accord. Divine's widow waded over finally to finish the job, the body slipping into the water as she cut it free. The Catholics crossed themselves in concert, and Jabez Trim said, "Naked came I from my mother's womb." The body was dragged out of the water by Divine's widow and Mary Trefina's father. No one else would touch it, though every soul on the beach crowded around to look. A young man's face, but the strangeness of the details made it impossible to guess his age. White eyebrows and lashes, a patch of salt white hair at the crotch. Even the lips were colorless, nipples so pale they were nearly invisible on the chest. Mary Trefina hugged her father's thigh and stared, Callum holding her shoulder to stop her moving any closer. They stood a while discussing this strange event. A fisherman washed overboard in a storm, or a suicide made strange by too many months at sea. Idle speculation that didn't begin to address the man's appearance or his grave in the whale's belly. They came finally to the consensus that life is a mystery and a wonder beyond human understanding. A conclusion they were comfortable with, though there was little comfort in the thought. The unfortunate soul was owed a Christian burial, and there was the rest of the day's work to get on with. Mary Trefina's father lifted the corpse by the armpits, while James Woundy took the legs, and the sorry little funeral train began its slow march up off the landwash. There were 3 stone steps at the head of the beach, the dead man's torso folding awkwardly on itself as they negotiated the rise, and a foul rainbow sprayed from the bowels. James Woundy jumped away from the mess, dropping the body against the rocks. "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," he said, his face gone nearly as white as the corpse. Callum tried to talk him into grabbing hold again, but he refused. "If he's alive enough to shit," James Woundy said, "he's alive enough to walk." Mary Trefina stood watching the pale, pale figure as the argument went on. A man delivered from the whale's belly and lying dead in his own filth on the stones. Entrance and exit, which should have been the end of the story, but somehow was not. Froth bubbled from the mouth, and when the corpse began coughing, all but the widow and Mary Trefina scattered up off the beach, running for their homes like the hounds of hell were at their heels. So that's how Judah arrived. And after that, the book gets a little bit nutty. I'm just gonna read a couple of poems from this book, and then if people, I know some people have to leave, go ahead and sneak out, and then I'll be happy to try and I'll take some questions. This is I'll do a couple. Yesterday was my birthday, as I mentioned. The day before that was the 12th anniversary of my dad's death. When I got married 8 years ago, and I wrote a series of poems for my wife when we got married. And I'll read one of these. This is something I wrote for my wife as a celebration of our marriage, and it's mostly about my dad dying of cancer, which some would say is typical of me. Anyway, it's called Something New. When test results confirmed what we feared, Dad was moved to the terminal ward, and my mother rarely left his side. All day to help him to and from his bed, to wash and feed him, rub his calves and feet, and she stayed there half the nights as well. Wouldn't give in to sleep. Sat up in a chair so she could keep tabs on any sound or motion from her husband lying across the room. Her nights at home, I stayed with Dad. But once he'd taken his evening meds, I slept through till morning, unless he called. Weeks into that shift work, before he told me the sleeping pills leached clear of his system in the loneliest hours, and he lay quiet at 3 and 4, so as not to disturb his company, dead to the world on a cot near the floor. I could never match Mom's fidelity to the vigil. Admired it from a distance that seemed a lack in me, a resistance I've always felt to risking love, the cut of it that goes hand in glove with tying yourself to something as frail as another person. bound to fail, was my thought. And I always managed to keep well clear. But my parents' marriage, in its final days on the cancer ward, made me think I'd lived my life a coward. Not the most romantic lines to preface a wedding declaration. But I don't know how else to name the place I started from, to frame how new this is, believing we're equal to what the world might offer or steal from us in the time we're given. We're not young enough to ask for heaven on earth, but here's a promise I will make: to stay by you, to be fully awake. And I'll just finish up with a piece that I'll dedicate this to anybody in the room who is now or has ever been in a partnership with kids in the house. This is called Getting the Marriage into Bed. Unplug the insatiable telephone, the apocalypse unfolding hourly on the network news crawl. Ignore the kitchen's Victorian factory of filthy dishes, the laundry pile suffocating a lost child in the basement. Ignore the lost children. Forget music and saffron and oysters. Put aside the cliched, the quaint rituals of wine and lingerie. Aphrodisiacs are for amateurs with more time than common sense, who've yet to learn bliss is stolen from the world in small, piercing slivers. Think of stealth as foreplay in the prison yard of daily events. Sneak out of your clothes as soon as the coast is clear. The air raid siren of a youngster crying is about to rise to the bedroom floor. The weight of the Three Gorges Reservoir has altered the planet's rotation by the same rate at which yesterday's dishes are going septic in the sink. Be resolute. Bliss lives for bliss alone. Apply yourself to that ephemeral sliver. You have less time than you think. Thanks very much.
Surprise! Rank here. Adam, this has begun. There's no way around it. That's what I've been realizing this past week. I gave up writing to you, and I felt this incredible relief. No doubt you did too. In fact, that was the only thing that tainted my relief, knowing you were probably relieved as well. But fuck it, it was over. It had been started, but now it was stopped, and so was over. Cooler heads prevailed and all that. I'd just go back.